We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Gemara in Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 20b. On the previous summit, the Gemara brought a brisa which listed a bunch of items that are memayit b'chalon, meaning to say if you have a window, so if you put these items in the window, they can make the opening considered to be smaller in terms of tumah, and they can be chotzets, they can block from the tumah. And one of the items that was listed in the brisa was melach, was salt. So the Gemara had asked, maybe you're going to use the salt, you'll take it away, why should that be memayit? And so the Gemara said it was not salt that was really usable, but then the Gemara said that maybe it's going to do damage to the wall, so for that reason you'll take it away, so it shouldn't be memayit. And the Gemara said that it was placed on top of a shard, so it's not doing any damage. But the Gemara then asked if it's placed on top of a shard, the shard itself should be chotzets from the tumah. And the Gemara now answers the less bas shiura, that it's not the proper size to be considered anything. As Rashi says, the less bas shiura v'have command the less, it's so small that it's like it's not there. And the Gemara says, Kidetanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, cheres, when it comes to pottery, like shards of pottery, kidei litein ben patzim lechaveiro. The idea over here is how much do you have to carry, that it's a chayiv when you carry it on Shabbos. This is a Mishnah Mesechet Shabbos. So it's the amount that you would put between one piece of wood and the next piece of wood. Rashi here explains, cheres le'inyan hotzah Shabbos. Again, we're talking here about a piece of earthenware in terms of carrying on Shabbos. Kidei litein ben patzim lechaveiro means to say, petzime chalonos shabakosel. Rashi understands we're talking about these pieces of wood that were placed in the windows of the wall. They would be a little distance from one another so that the light could pass through. You would put a little piece of earthenware between each one, and then you would use a little cement, and the cheres was thick, it was like a stone, it was sitting there like a stone, and so that's the amount. But if it's less than that, that's like it's not there at all, and that's why it's not going to be chotzets b'fnei hatoma. But the Gemara continues, kli cheres. But what about the next thing in the list of the brayos that said that kli cheres, that's also memayit b'chalon? So chazile, isn't that fit to use? Why is that something that's memayit b'chalon? You're going to take it out to use it. And the Gemara says the mitana, if it's dirty, so you're not going to use it. But the Gemara says still, even if it's dirty, chazi l'umna, isn't it fit for a bloodletter to collect the blood? And the Gemara says the minkav, it has a hole in it, so it's not fit for anything. That's why it's essentially batel over there, and it's memayit b'chalon. And the Gemara continues, Sefer Torah. Another thing, the next thing in the list was Sefer Torah. That's also usable. Chazi l'mikra, you can read from it. The Gemara says, Bebali, we're talking about in a situation where the Sefer Torah is old, you can't read the letters anymore. V'habai geniza, but the Gemara says, but still, you're going to remove it because it needs geniza. You need to take it and store it away. And the Gemara says, Sham tehei geniza, so it can be stored right there. That's where you're planning on leaving it. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav says, B'chol osin mechitza. With anything you can make a mechitza, chutz mi melach uravav. Anything can be considered to be a mechitza, a separation, a wall, except for salt and except for fat. And Rashi here explains, chutz mi melach uravav, mimnei she'hamelach mispazer, because the salt, it scatters, it doesn't really stay fixed. V'haravav nitach k'shemischamim. And also when it comes to the fat, that's just going to melt away when it becomes warm. And the Gemara continues, Shmuel Amar, and Shmuel says, Afilu melach, even salt can be used as a mechitza. And the Gemara says, Amar Rapapa says, Velo pligi. Really, Rav and Shmuel here are not arguing. It depends what kind of salt. Hava melach stomis. In one case, we're talking about melach stomis, and hava melach isteroknis. The other case, we're talking about a different kind of salt called melach isteroknis. Rashi here explains melach stomis, melach of stone, was ovid, that was thicker, v'kasha ke'evin, it was hard like a stone, so that could make a mechitza, but the melach isteroknis cannot make a mechitza. And the Gemara continues, V'hashta damar Rabba, but now that Rabba said, Osa adam shneitzi bore melech, that a person can make 2 columns of salt, umeiniach aleim kor, and then put a beam on top of the columns, shahamelech ma'amedes hatzakora, va'akora ma'amedes hatzamelech, because the salt, it holds up the beam, but the beam also holds the salt in place. In other words, there is a way to hold salt in place, so if you say that, if you follow that, afilu melech isteroknis, you could even say we're talking about melech isteroknis, v'lo pligi, and Rav and Shmuel are not arguing, ha'de'ika kora, one is talking about where there's a beam to hold it in place, then it could be a mechitza, and ha'deleka kora, the other one is talking about where there's no beam to hold it in place, and in that case it would scatter, therefore it's not considered to be a mechitza. Rashi explains, Shnei tzibori melech gevoim asara. The idea is you have 2 pillars of salt that are 10 tvachim high, eitzel kosle mavoi, you're putting these next to the walls of a mavoi, umeniach shnei roshei koros ha-mavoi alei, and then you put the beam on top of them, shekovid hakora mamid as-ha-melech, because the weight of the beam, it holds the melech in place. The idea is you're setting up this tzuras ha-pesach, sort of, for the entry of the mavoi that has to do with hilchas erevin. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Marchikin es harechayim gimel min hashechev shein arba min harechev. You have to distance the mill from the wall. It has to be 3 tvachim away from the lower stone of the mill and 4 tvachim away from the upper stone of the mill. And the Gemara says, my time, and what's the reason it has to be distance? What's the damage? Mishum tirya, the reason is that there's vibrations that cause damage to the wall. The Gemara says, Vatanya, but didn't we learn in a brayso of a shel chamor? Now, in terms of a shel chamor, Rashi seems to translate it of the mill of a donkey, although others say we're talking about a mill that is set upon a base. We'll go with the explanation of the mill of a donkey. So, shalosha minhu istarobel, shehin arba min hakeles. That's 3 tvachim away from the istarobel, which is 4 tvachim away from the keles. And Rashi explains, v'shel chamor of a donkey, rechayim shel chamor, again, a mill of a donkey. It's derobla, so then it says that it's going to be 3 away from the istarobel, which Rashi says, that's the lower part of the mill. Shabesoch klipas ha'etz shekor in circuits like a base, and kelas hiafrachasas, that's like the upper part of the mill. And so the Gemara continues its question, Hasam over there, my tirya ika, what kind of vibrations are over there? And the Gemara says, Ella mishum kala, rather it's because of the noise. Now there's a machlokas rishonim here if you should have the word Ella. In other words, when it says mishum kala because of the noise, it might just be going on the mill of the donkey. If you have the word Ella, we're going back on the original thing we said, and even the mill in the Mishnah, it's really because of the coal, it's really because of the noise. Rashi says, my tirya ika, what vibrations are there by the mill of the donkey? Rechaim ketanim v'kalim. The point is, this is a very small mill. The ein hakarka marid begilgulo, the land is not going to tremble, it's not going to vibrate. And the Gemara answered, Mishum Kol, it's because of the noise. Rashi seems to be saying Mishum Kol is just going on the one of the donkey. Yesh Mefarshim, some say Kol Hanhagas HaChamor, it means the noise when you're trying to lead the donkey. V'yesh Mefarshim, and some say Kol HaRechaim, it means the noise of the mill itself. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, V'yes HaTanor Shalosha min HaKilya Shein Arba min HaSafa. When it comes to the oven, it's 3 tvachim away from the Kilya. The Kilya is the base of the oven, which is 4 tvachim away from the Safa, which is the rim of the oven. And the Gemara says, Amar Abaya, Abaya says, Shmami, no, we see from this, Kilya de Tanor Tefach, that when it comes to the Kilya of the Tanor, meaning to say the difference in size in terms of how much larger, the base is going to be 1 Tefach more than from where the upper rim is. Nafkamina lemekach umemkar, the difference is in terms of buying and selling, you should know the proper proportion. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Lo yamid adam tanor besoch habayis, a person should not set up an oven in a house, Elim kain yesh al gabav, unless you have enough airspace above it, Gova arba amos, there should be at least 4 amos above the oven. The idea is that somebody lives on the upper floor, so you need to have enough space from where the oven is until the ceiling, which is the floor of the person who lives on top. Hayamamido ba'aliyah, let's say the person who lives up on the second floor, he's the one setting up the oven. Tzarech she'ei tachtov ma'aziva shlosha tvachim, so underneath the oven, you have to have 3 tvachim thick plaster. Uvekira, now if it's a kira, which is a smaller kind of stove, so then tefach, you just need 1 tefach. V'yim hizik mashali masha hizik. Now the Tanna Kama says, even if you have all these precautions, but if damage is done, you do have to pay for the damage. Rabbi Shimon says, Lo amru kol hashiyurin ha'elu ela shem hizik pater milashalim. The only reason that we mention all of these measurements is that if the person does take the proper precautions, on the contrary, even if damage is done, he's pater, he doesn't have to pay. And the Mishnah continues, Lo yiftach adam chanus shel nachtomin v'shel tzavoin tachas otzaro shel chavero. A person should not open up a bakery or a dye shop underneath the storehouse of his friend. The idea is that the heat from what is coming from down below is going to damage the grain that's in the storehouse. V'lo refes bakar, similarly, you shouldn't have a barn there, again, underneath the storehouse, because the bad odor is going to ruin the grain that's being stored. And the Mishnah says, be'emes, in truth, biyayin, when it comes to wine, hitiru, it's actually permitted, because when it comes to wine, the bakery or the dye shop actually don't do any damage to the wine. Avalo refes bakar, but that's not true by a barn of cattle. There, the odor actually will damage the wine. And Rashi explains, Uvekira, by a smaller kind of stove, maziva tefach, you just need 1 tefach of plaster. Afi klicheres shofsim keder al chalola. Kira also is like an earthenware vessel which you put a pot on top of it. It's like a stove. Vein osin besocha has a gadol. The difference between that and a tanor is that the fire is not as large, kemosha osin betanor, like a tanor, which is a larger fire. Vim hizik, and if damage is done, this was the opinion of the Tanna Kama, even if you took all the necessary precautions, you still have to pay. Achar sheyesham kol hashiurin halolu, even if you had all of these proper distancing shiurim, meshali mash hizik, he still has to pay what he damages. V'yava b'chein, now even though he's responsible for damages, ma'akvin olav hashcheinim laharchik b'chol hashiurim halolu, the neighbors can force him to do all the proper regulations, all the proper distancing, shami yadlik batayim ve'ein lo malashalim, because maybe there's going to be a fire, maybe he won't be able to reimburse them, so they don't rely on the fact that he's going to pay them back. back, they're still allowed to enforce the precautions. And then at the end of the Mishnah it said, B'yayin hitiru, by wine it's mutter, meaning, Im haya otzer shal yayin, let's say the storehouse has wine, hitiru liftoach tachtav chanus shal nachtom, and then it's okay to have a bakery underneath, v'tzavoin, or a dye shop underneath, she'ein ha'oshen kasher l'yayin, because the smoke that comes is not bad for wine, avalo refes bakar, but you can't have the barn with the cattle, shahareach kasher l'yayin, because the bad odor is bad for the wine. And the Gemara says, V'atanya, but didn't we learn in a brisa, b'tanur arbo v'kira shlosh, it says by a tanur that's on the upper floor, you need plaster of 4 tvachim, and by a kira you need 3 tvachim. In our mission it said by tanur you need 3 tvachim, and by kira you need 1 tefach. Rashi says, V'atanya l'ini ma'amida b'aliyah, we're going on the case in the Mishnah of putting it in the upper floor, b'tanur arbo ma'aziva mitachtav v'kira shlosha. It says again by a tanur you need 4 tvachim of plaster, by a kira you need 3 tvachim of plaster. And the Gemara answers, Amar Abaya says, Kitanya, that brisa is talking bidin achtomin. We're talking about a baker. Rashi says bidin achtomin shamasikin oso tomin. They're always using the oven and the stove. V'chein hakira bekiras nachtomin. Kira also is talking about akiras nachtomin. That's why you need a greater amount of plaster in that situation. As the Gemara elaborates, the tanur didon kikira de nachtomin. Our tanur is the same as a kira of the nachtomin. Rashi says tanur didon deyoy beitanur de masishin shir gimel tvachim. The tanur of our Mishnah for a regular tanur not belonging to a baker says 3 tvachim. That's the equivalent kikira de nachtomin dami. That's the equivalent of the kira of the baker. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, Lo yiftach chanus v'chulu. It said you can't open a bakery or a dye shop, or you can't have a refes bakar underneath an otzar. And the Gemara says, Tana was taught, Im haisa refes kodemes la'otzar. Let's say the barn with the cattle actually came before the storehouse, so then it was there with permission, so then mutter, then it's going to be mutter. The Gemara says, Boya, Abaya asks the following question, Kibed v'ribeitz la'otzar. Let's say he cleaned and sprinkled in preparation to have an otzar. Is that like the otzar was already there, so it could be considered like the otzar was there first in that case? Mahu, what would be the halacha? Similar questions, Riba b'chalonos mahu. Let's say he made a bunch of windows, indicating he was going to have an otzar. Achsadra tachas otzar mahu. Let's say as an achsadra, veranda underneath the storehouse. What's the halacha in that situation? Bona ali al gabe beso. Let's say he built this upper floor on his house, indicating he's going to have an otzar. Mahu, what's the halacha in that situation? And the Gemara says to all these questions, take the Gemara leaves it as a question. Boy, Rav Huna braid Rav Yoshua. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, asked, Tamri v'rimoni mai. What if he started storing dates or pomegranates, not the usual grain? What's the halacha there? And the Gemara says, take the Gemara leaves that as a question. Rashi explains, kibed v'ribetz, he cleaned and he sprinkled, meaning gago letzorach otzar. He has this roof and he started to clean it, started to get it ready for storing. V'lo hispek lahachnes lo tvua, but he didn't begin to put the grain in. At shepasach zeh tanos tachtav. Then this guy goes ahead and opens a store underneath. Mi havi kekodem laotzar odilma. Is it as if he came before the otzar? Odilma dekevan the kibed v'ribeitz havi kekidem haotzar. Maybe it's like the otzar's there first because he's already preparing the otzar. And the Gemara also asked Riva b'chalonos. Let's say he puts a bunch of windows ba'aliyasu in his upper floor. To gali daite shel otzar hu asoy. He's showing that he does intend on using it as a storehouse. Sheikonis lo aver shelo yirkav atvua. The whole idea is that some air gets in there, that the grain should not spoil. Or bona aliyah al gabe beso. Let's say he builds an upper floor in his house, al gago on his roof. Or regilin ha you live no sham loser. They would usually build that in order to have a storehouse. Mao, what's the halacha there? Imtim saloma riva b'chalonos lav hakdamu. If you're going to say that having a lot of windows is not enough, hechi tekula binyana lahachiyav in my. What if the whole building was made for that? What's the halacha? And we will note that Rashi doesn't mention anything about the question of the Gemara achsadra tachas otzar mao, that if there's a veranda under the otzar, what's the halacha? Rashi doesn't seem to have it. The Bach as well says to take out that line. And Rashi explains tamri v'rimoni, the dates and the pomegranates, hichnis sham tamorim v'rimonim. Let's say a person puts into the storehouse dates and pomegranates, mihave hascholas otzar. Is that the beginning of a storehouse? Odilmar maybe ein otzar ala betvua v'yayin v'shemen. Maybe it's only called an otzar if you have either grain, wine, or oil. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, b'yemes b'yayin hitiru v'chulu. In truth, if you have a storehouse of wine, it's actually okay to have a bakery or a dye shop underneath. It's only a problem if there's a refes bakar, if there's a barn. And the Gemara says, Tana was taught, b'yayin hitiru, the reason why by wine it's mutter mibnei shemashbicho is because in actuality the bakery or the dye shop actually improves the wine. V'lo refes bakar, however, the refes bakar is a problem mibnei shemasricho because it causes it to spoil, it smells bad. Amar Rav Yosef says, Hai didon, when it comes to our wine, afilu kutra deshar ganami kashalei. Our wine is different, and even a little smoke from a candle is bad for it. So in our wine, we would not say that a dye shop and a bakery are beneficial. We would say it's problematic. Amar Rav Sheshes says, v'aspasta, when it comes to aspasta, which is a kind of inferior grain, karefes bakar damya, that's the same as a barn with cattle. And Rashi explains, v'haidi don yayin shalonu, meaning our wine, afilu ashan ha'olam min haner kashalo, even a little smoke from a candle is going to be damaging. Aspasta, again, is shachas shel tvua. It's like this inferior grain. Kerefes bakar damya, that's the same thing as a barn of cattle, meaning machmas shulachum eschamim amal esirchon. It's something that decays, it spoils, and it can cause damage, and so that's the same thing as having a barn underneath the storehouse. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Chanus shebechotzer, if you have a store in a courtyard, Yachol limchos biyadu, the neighbor can say, I don't want you to set up a store in this courtyard, Velomarlo, because he can say to him, Eini Yachol lishon, mikol ha'nichnasun, mikol ha'yotzon, I can't sleep, there's too many people coming in and out to buy things, so a neighbor's allowed to protest and say, you can't make a store in this courtyard. Avol osa kelim, but a person who has a house in the courtyard is allowed to make vessels, Yotzei u'mocher b'soch hashuk, to take out and sell them in the marketplace, Ve'eno Yachol limchos biyadu, the neighbor can't protest, Velomarlo, and say to him, Eini Yachol lishon lo mikol ha'patish v'lo mikol ha'rechayim v'lo mikol ha'tinokos, that I can't sleep because of the sound of the hammer or the sound of the mill or the sound of the children. In other words, a person is allowed to make reasonable use of his home. And Rashi explains, v'lo mikol ha'tinokos, I can't sleep because of the children. Kasal kadaitach, right now we think tinokos haboim liknos yayin v'shemen. We think we're talking about the children that are coming to buy wine and oil, v'chol davar hanimkar b'chanus, or things that are sold in a store. And the Gemara says, Ma'ishna Reisha u'Ma'ishna Seifa. What's the difference in the Reisha? The beginning of the Mishnah, we say it's problematic. We say you're allowed to protest the store, but in the end of the Mishnah, talking about the Kalim, all of a sudden there, the person is not allowed to protest. What's the difference? Rashi says, Ma'ishna Reisha, the Katani Yachol Omreini Yachol Lishon, Mikol HaNichnason Vayotzin. In the Reisha it says that a person can say, I can't sleep because of the noise of the people coming in and out. V'Seifa Katani, but in the end it says, Eino Yachol Omerlo. He can't say to him, Eini Yachol Lishon Mikol HaTinokos, that I can't sleep because of the sound of the children that are coming in and out. And so the Gemara says, Amar Abaya says, Seifa ason l'chotzer acheres. The Seifa is talking about another chotzer. And what Abaya means to say is that the end of the Mishnah is actually talking about a resident not of that chotzer, but that a resident of a different chotzer that's nearby, let's say it's a chotzer that's part of the same alleyway, that resident is not allowed to complain, even though a resident of the same chotzer is allowed to complain. Amar le Rava said to Abaya, Ihachi, if so, if your interpretation is correct, so listen, chotzer acheres mutter, that's what the Mishnah should have said, a resident of a different chutzner, so then it's mutter, that person can't protest. Elo my Rava, rather, Rava says, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video, on Daf Chaf Aleph, Amud Aleph.